President Aissati, thank you for your presentation. Let's now move straight away to a sixth session. We had 2 days to review global, international and national rankings and to hear about excellence initiatives. They are now under a dark shadow of COVID-19. During the session, our speakers would try to tell us what will be the future. That's a difficult question. Title of the session, Impact of COVID-19, and there are 2 speakers, Mr. Alex Asher, Canada, and Mr. Richard Holmes, Malaysia. Gentlemen, if you are ready, it's your time.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Alex, you're going first.
I think maybe I'll just introduce things and then I'll hand things over to you. So listen, hello everyone. Good morning and buenos dias if you're in the Americas. Bonjour, guten Abend if you're in Europe, and Wanshang and Kalban Va if you are in Asia. We know we're the last session here. I think what we're going to do is something a little bit different. When we talk about COVID and its challenges, I think there's sort of there's a short-term aspect and a long-term aspect, and we want to make sure that we cover both of those in here. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to let Richard talk for a few minutes about how COVID is going to change the rankings in the short term, or what it's going to do to existing rankings. I then want to introduce a little bit of some longer term thinking about how it will change the way we think about rankings and what it is we value about universities. And then I'm going to ask Richard to come back in and maybe comment a little bit on what I've said. So that will take us to about 8:40 my time. We're going to try and be done with a little bit of time to spare, so we've got some questions. So I guess I'll leave it to you. Richard, over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to start the presentation, and the slides should be appearing. Yes, they've appeared. Okay, let's see if the software works. Okay, it does, but it comes out a little bit blurred, but okay, never mind. I'm going to talk about questions rather than making predictions. So, first question I want to raise is whether COVID-19 is a completely unique crisis, or whether it is simply accelerating current trends, speeding up things a little bit. And then I'm going to look at online learning, student mobility, financial problems, problems relating to admissions, and so on. Then move on to questions about the impact of the virus and responses to the virus on the rankings, and possible trends in ranking methodology. Okay, looking first at online learning. The virus, I think, is not sort of something really new with regard to online learning. It's accelerating things that have been working already, started already. And on my desk, I have a journal, The American Interest, Virtualized, the End of the University as We Know It. This is from February 2013. That's 7 years ago. Already 7 years ago, we were talking about online learning transforming higher education. Okay, online learning has had a long ancestry. We've had correspondence schools, open universities, distance learning for many, many decades. But it is accelerating in 2020. Malaysian universities, as I know from personal observation, are now entirely online. UK seems to be mixed. I'm not quite sure what is exactly going on. In Nigeria, private universities are online. I don't know about public universities. They seem to be on strike. Okay. Online learning is probably going to be here to stay. We won't go back to 100% face-to-face teaching. I don't think it will ever become completely widespread. I have a feeling that face-to-face teaching will be a status symbol. It will be a mark of pride for universities to say that you actually have some sort of contact with a real-life human being. But obviously, online learning, I think, is going to become much more widespread than it ever has been before. And there's obviously going to be a massive disruption to international student mobility. The numbers of students going overseas will drop drastically. The destinations will change. Many students will go away. They will abandon international education. They will not return. And in addition to that, local students will be staying away as well. With regard to admissions, I've noticed that many American universities are abandoning standardized testing, public examinations. I really don't quite understand exactly what's going on in the UK. John O'Leary, I think, referred to it. And it's probably the case that many students will be less academically prepared. And in addition to that, disruptions to secondary education will mean that universities will have to make adjustments to the standards that they demand and the demands that they make on students. Okay. This is something which I think Alex can talk about much more than I can. The economics, the finances of the universities as universities stay away, as students stay away from universities, especially international students, there's going to be a serious economic problem for universities. And there's going to be, one way or another, there's going to be savage cuts all over the place. And this is going to occur at a time when the entire economy is suffering massive problems. So we're going to have serious problems. How long this will last, I don't know. It is possible that we'll have a situation like the novel by Arthur Herzog, IQ 83, in which a scientist at the last minute injects himself with an effective vaccine, and in a few days everything is back to normal. That is not going to happen. It's possible that there may be more viruses on the way. It's also extremely likely that the economic consequences of the lockdowns will accelerate and produce very serious problems. Okay, how will this reflect the rankings? First of all, it's not going to happen immediately. We shouldn't expect rankings to start showing the impact of the virus or the impact of government policies immediately. Most rankings have some sort of safeguards against sudden short-term changes. Biometric indicators are aggregated over 4 years, 5 years, National Taiwan University over 11 years. Surveys are averaged over 2 years or 5 years. Shanghai rankings, one of their indicators measures Nobel Prize winners who've been dead for several decades. Citations are the combination of a process that begins a decade, half a decade or more, with a grant proposal. So we don't really expect anything to happen in 2021. Okay, but after that, after 2022, we can expect the rankings to start showing the effect of the virus and the effect of the measures taken to combat the virus. I don't know how long this is going to last. Louise Nicole says that Australia is going to be the student mobility comeback kid. Maybe it will. Simon Margison says 5 or 10 years to recover. I think there's a possibility that there may never, ever be a full recovery. Also, the rankings themselves may be affected by the virus. I suspect that Times Higher Education and QS are losing their summit income. I suspect that many ranking employers are working from home, and so on. Okay, I think it's likely that eventually, as funds dry up, as poor work conditions accumulate, we can expect many researchers to leave Western universities to go to Asia, Middle East, possibly to leave academia altogether for the private industrial sector. And this will cause a decline in the indicators that measure publications, patents, and citations. Right, so as I said, the rankers are probably going to be effective. They are going to have to think about changing their indicators. Some of these smaller rankers may not be profitable anymore. I think that the rankings which are produced by universities, which employ a handful of students and interns and full-time workers, may not be able to continue much longer. Specifically, the rankers have some rankers have dropped hints that they will be changing their indicators. THE has again postponed reforms which have been anticipated for a couple of years. I have a feeling that THE will be downgrading their World University rankings and putting much more emphasis on their impact rankings and their national and regional teaching rankings. So possible future trends. Rankers will definitely be looking at ways of assessing online learning. The traditional indicators for doing this are not really going to be viable any longer. Faculty-student ratio will have to be replaced, maybe by the amount of screen time that students spend, maybe robot student ratio. They will also be looking for ways to measure contributions to social mobility and sustainability. There's going to be less emphasis on international students and international faculty, probably much more on international research collaboration, which I think is going to continue at the present rate or even expand over the next few years. And I think that as the information provided by rankings becomes more and more important, it's going to decide whether universities merge or close down. Rankings will come under greater scrutiny, and they will be subject to more careful observation. We've already seen this with the Leiden Manifesto, the Berlin Principles, and other attempts to provide a general framework for ethical and accurate ranking. One of these, which has just developed recently, is produced by the International Network of Research Management Systems. It's called Rating the Rankers. It's a new initiative. It's emphatically a tool for rating not for ranking. And the underlying motivation is to encourage improvement rather than to penalize. Okay, it's very much a pilot project, but it is promising. And we've seen with Ludo's presentation earlier that it's already had a sort of impact on at least one major ranking. It's ranking universities, please excuse me, rating rankings according to 4 values, that is good governance, measuring what matters, transparency, and rigor. And I think it can provide a sort of a new way of looking at rankings. Right, okay, to summarize and to let Alex have his turn, universities are entering a period of unknown but certainly great disruption and uncertainty. This will not appear immediately, it won't appear in 2020, probably not even 2021, but eventually problems will be observed, will be organized, will be noticed by the rankings. And rankings, therefore, will have a serious responsibility to record changes accurately and ethically. Okay, so they are very likely to come under increasing scrutiny and informed scrutiny over the next.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me just react. I agree with basically everything Richard said, and I'm going to amplify a little bit on some of his later remarks. I think the only thing I might have a little bit of a question about is really the issue of international students. I actually think I know a lot of people are very pessimistic about the return of international students. I'm very optimistic. I'm pretty sure we'll be back to 2019 levels by 2023. So actually, and I know I'm an outlier on that one, but I do really believe that the international student thing is going to be one of the first things to come back. But I guess where I want to pick up where Richard's leading off about why rankings might change. And I think it's important to remember that rankings are above all, international university rankings are children of the 1990s. The very first international ranking was the Asia Week ranking, which I believe had 2 or 3 issues, 97, 98, 99, around there. And there were very particular conditions around, the turn of the century in the world. Europe was suddenly united and growing and adopting the Lisbon Agenda, which was a knowledge agenda, and therefore, you cared about research output a lot. China had joined the WTO, and it was, still building on post-1978 works of Deng Xiaoping of using universities and higher education to build a high-tech economy and climb the value chain that way. And underneath all of that is an admiration. It seems difficult to remember now, but there was a real admiration for the U.S. economic model. Those were the 1990s, and growth was quick. And even after the dot-com bust, there was a rebound, and people believed that this was somehow linked to the innovative capacity of its universities. I think that was largely based on sort of Stanford and MIT, but that was it. And so there was a model to look at. I mean, when you think about rankings, what they really are is they're telling you to what extent each of these universities contain particular qualities. And there was unanimity about what the qualities of a good university was. Unanimity is a bit extreme. Consensus is probably a bigger word. That people believe that it really was about internationalization and open borders and research outputs of various types. The problem is, I think that time is gone. We're 20 years out from that now, and I think in a lot of countries in the West anyway, there's a declining belief that economic growth is even possible, right? I mean, I think we've been in a long slump, a very long slump now since about 2008. And, if you don't think growth is important or even possible, then knowledge doesn't necessarily get you very far, right? We certainly you don't hear anywhere near the talk about knowledge-based economies that we used to. I think there's a growing belief in parts of the world that inequality is a bigger problem than growth. And sometimes that's just an economic inequality, and sometimes it is, it's related to matters of race. But there's certainly a belief in those countries where that's a problem that higher education is often making the problem of inequality worse. You certainly see that in North America. I think you see it in parts of Europe. Certainly, even where there is, free education, there's still a lot of stratification that seems to be intergenerational stratification, which seems to be built into the higher education system, and that matters more these days. When people think about what do I care about my universities, I think increasingly they're likely to say things like inequality than they are to talk about research output. I think. And there's a number of other things. I think there's skepticism about ever-increasing internationalization. You certainly see in various parts of Europe, there's calls for, Denmark is trying to reduce the number of foreign students who are coming. Switzerland has had a problem with this. I mean, it keeps coming up as an irritant, that universities are spending too much time paying attention to international students and not enough to domestic students. There's the nature of the climate emergency. Again, I think, what are universities for? If it's not economic growth, it's the climate emergency. Well, how well do we measure what it is that universities do to work on the climate emergency? And finally, I think there's the issue of whether or not research is still considered an open public good. I mean, I think the rise of U.S.-China tensions over the last decade puts into question a lot of that. I mean, I think we're at the point now where we're starting to kick each other's scientists out of the country, out of certain countries. I think it's very difficult to suggest that that value is good. And so I think all the basics were there before COVID, and then COVID hits. And COVID is breeding a certain new nationalism. No question about that. And I think that also reduces the implied value of internationalization. I think there are very big cuts to research that are coming, which are going to make it more difficult for people in some countries to focus on research. And I think even in some countries, you're seeing a view that universities shouldn't be relying on research so much. So in China, they've basically said, the C9 should not be so rigid about making their grad students publish in two journal articles before they get their PhDs. You're seeing movements in the Netherlands and in Belgium to try to shift the balance towards teaching and away from research. And so I think if you don't have consensus about what universities are for, and I don't think that a new consensus is emerging, right? I think countries are going in a different direction. You're seeing a lot of localism in what matters, but the consensus of the early 2000s is gone, and COVID has not played a decisive role there, but it's certainly nudged it along. Maybe there's no consensus, and what consensus? The only consensus is that the old consensus probably isn't good enough, and so I think people will want rankings to look at things like student success and student social mobility and and various things like that. And frankly, we don't have any rankings that really do that well. We have U-Multi-Rank. I think U-Multi-Rank does get at some of this in a sensible way. I think you have the THE impact rankings. Those are a really interesting step to try and look at a lot of these issues. The problem is, conceptually, the THE impact rankings are pretty, I don't want to say dodgy, but they're not a fantastic basis to rate universities. Any university, it's not complete, right? Universities are competing basically on whichever of the various SDGs they want to. Right, so I've forgotten how many. There's over a dozen different areas they can submit data on, but they only have to submit data in 3. In many ways, the scoring is ludicrous. So, I mean, you get points for having a policy, but no points for what the policy actually, policy on climate change, policy on staff leave, those kinds of things. I understand what they're trying to do, right? Like, it's not, I'm coming across as being more negative about the impact rankings than I mean to be. It's just that what they're trying to measure is very difficult to quantify. There's a lot of qualitative judgments involved in saying whether a university is doing well in an area like social mobility. Not every country defines social mobility the same way. When it comes to treating staff well, or, various types of sustainability. I don't think these sort of yes, no's, we have policies, we don't have policies, I don't think they're very helpful. And of course, I think there's the issue with both U-Multi-Rank and the THE Impact rankings, which is that most of the big universities in the world don't want to participate. I mean, this has always been a problem with rankings, right? Is that they're not seen as being particularly valid unless the big universities participate, and the big universities will not participate unless it shows them in a glowing light. And rankings that were based on perception and research output, well, those are great, right? I mean, those always make Harvard and Princeton and NUS and whoever, they make them look great. But if they don't, then they play, right? And so I think that's the problem. It's the real challenge, and I don't see really any way to get around this problem. All rankings require some form of uniform data across countries, and there are no national systems actually have of data collection on universities have moved very little, in fact, since the introduction of rankings. I don't see them moving much quicker now, and I don't see universities converging on particular definitions. So I think the data problem is there to stay. And I don't think that rankings will disappear. That's not what I'm saying here. I think they will simply be seen as less relevant in large parts of the world. So they will be a phenomenon of decreasing intensity, if I can put it that way. They'll be they won't be as high stakes. In some countries, they will be. I mean, those countries who kept that turn of the century consensus that research is everything, and internationalization is still good. Yeah, in those places, rankings will still be important. And I would expect that would be true of much of Asia. So I think Richard's remark that the international rankings will be downgraded in favor of regional rankings is probably a pretty smart one. I think that's I mean, just because I think that they will try to evolve in different ways in different countries because there isn't a global consensus about the purpose of the university to the extent there was 20 years ago. And so for rankings to remain relevant, they may need to become less global. And that's my presentation. I'd hand it back over to Richard, maybe if you've got a minute or two just to comment on what I've said, and then we'll go to questions.
Yeah. Okay, one thing I'd like to sort of observe is that, I think you're right about the declining belief in growth, internationalization, consensus about climate change and so on. I think this is far more applicable to the West, particularly North America, than to Asia, particularly East Asia. I don't think that in China, Malaysia, Singapore, there's a declining interest in growth. I think on the question of climate change, yes, there is pretty much sort of divergence. And you mentioned the THE impact rankings. One noticeable thing about those rankings is that they're pretty much being boycotted by China. Only about a dozen Chinese universities are taking part. So I'm beginning to think that with regard to higher education and research, we're beginning to see a great divergence, bifurcation, division of the world into two poles, and we're going to see an interest in different kinds of rankings in the two parts of the world. I suspect that China and East Asia will probably continue to be interested in measures of research output, research quality, student quality and graduate quality and so on, and not really interested in issues of social equity, climate change, and so on. Whereas there will be a movement towards those things in North America and the other parts of the West, Australia and Western Europe. So I think we're going to probably have the development of two different kinds of international rankings, one for the West, one for Asia, particularly China.
Yeah, agree completely.
Yeah. So shall we move on to taking questions? We've only got about 8 minutes left now. How do the questions appear? They're used. Is there a chat? Wait a minute.
Apparently there's no questions from the audience so far, is the message I've got here. We'll see if there are any. We'll just give everybody a chance. I think it's a typing in questions thing, so it may take a little bit. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right, Richard. That Asia and the West are growing further apart on what they want universities to be. It's interesting to think about what will happen to the other parts of the world, right? So I think. I think in Latin America, the consensus view about what universities for is probably a little closer already to where Europe and North America are moving. I don't know where Africa and the Middle East will go on this. I think it's an interesting question. I think you're right that there's a push. I think they will be quite torn in the sense that they're still learning the rules of the game, of the sort of the international ranking game. They're just starting to put real numbers into the top 500 or top 1,000, whatever it happens to be. And it will be interesting to see which way they move in terms of their priorities. I don't have a good sense of either of those regions. I'd be really happy if anybody from the audience could maybe comment on that. That would be quite useful.
Yeah. I think given the current geopolitical trends, my suspicion is that Africa and the Middle East will be more inclined to follow the Chinese example, Chinese influence, and they will start to try to compete on traditional methods of research quality and research productivity measured by publications and citations. I have a feeling that
which also has
the current,
I was just going to say, I mean, it also has the benefit of being cheaper.
Sorry.
Because it has the benefit of being cheaper, right? In a sense, you can go to SciVal or whatever site you want. You can do the bibliometrics that way, and it doesn't work very well in terms, whereas I think the kinds of things that people are going to want in Europe and in North America, those are much more data intensive. You know what I mean? Like it just costs a lot more to collect that kind of data. So I think you might be right, if for no other reason than that. Yeah.
Yes, I think you have to realize that the collection of data for, let's say, the THE impact rankings imposes a massive burden on universities. The amount of data that they want simply doesn't exist for large parts of the world. And I think a lot of it has to be suspected anyway. And I think it's unreasonable to expect a struggling university in Africa, or indeed many other parts of the world, to allocate 3 or 4 full-time researchers to collect the data that is demanded for rankings like this, when they could be doing research on other things. So I can't see the sort of the new wave of impact socially orientated rankings getting very much traction in Africa or indeed many parts of Asia.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I guess the issue is in the sense that the you know, in a sense, you can always, the Chinese rankings, the Asian ranking, Asian style of rankings, if you want to put it that way, they can go on forever, even without the participation of Western agencies, because for precisely the same reason, right? And the bibliometric stuff, that's just available. You don't actually need someone in an institution to help you out with any data. That's been the big strength. It's the way that the Shanghai rankings were able to get started and be so complete with almost no budget to start with. And I mean, I guess what I find a little, I mean, there's an edge to some of the Western commentary on rankings. One of the most interesting edges I've seen recently is what about academic freedom? And I think as we, you know, it is an era of, you know, I think if you look at places like Freedom House, you do see freedom declining in certain parts of the world. There are clampdowns in many countries. And so I think in effect, it's going to look to Asia as if, you know, when it comes to rankings, Western Europe and America are going to, you know, pick up their balls and go home and say, well, we don't actually want to compete in this area to a certain extent, and we're going to compete in some other measure. And I wonder if that's, you know, if rankings themselves, if that is the way they evolve, if they aren't going to contribute to a sense of division in the world.
Yeah, I think there's a feeling in many parts of Asia that Western universities are being somewhat hypocritical in complaining about restrictions on freedom in academic freedom in India, for example, China, for example, Pakistan, while at the same time ignoring growing restrictions on what can be said, what can be researched in Western universities, particularly if it relates to identity politics. So, yeah, again, I think that there's a growing risk of a bipolar world developing. I noticed on the chat that Isidro and Louise are logged in. Does that mean that we have to?
Well, I think it's getting time for us to make way anyway. Yes. Yeah, I think so. Yes. So I know that we're going to the final session right now, and there's a presentation, a special presentation to Isidro Aguillo from Spain. Isidro, my best wishes, congratulations on this award.
Yes,
but
congratulations.
Well deserved. Yes. And so I think, you know, just to sum it up, I think we are going to head into a new world of rankings. There is going to be some short-term turbulence in some of the rankings, and long-term, maybe rankings won't be such a global phenomenon. They may be a much more fractured phenomenon, and in some countries, at least, maybe less important as a result. But in some parts of the world also, I think global rankings, particularly ones which are easily produced around bibliometric measures, they may stick around for a long time, even if they don't have the same global significance. And with that, it's goodbye from Toronto and goodbye from Kuala Lumpur. And thank you very much.
Goodbye.